Why don't you start by just introducing yourself and telling me why you're running for mayor?
So I'm Todd Gloria. I'm a state assembly member, 78th District, state of California, candidate for mayor of San Diego. I'm running for mayor because as a third generation San Diegan, I know where our city has been. As the son of a maid and a gardener, I know how hard it is for working people to make ends meet in a place as expensive as San Diego. And importantly, I have a vision for where I would like to take our city over the next number of years. My belief is that too often we are a big city that operates like a small town, and that's exhibited in our exploding homelessness crisis, our poor state of our infrastructure, and our outrageous housing affordability problems here. I want to be a mayor that tackles those issues as well as leads on containing the COVID-19 virus and getting our economy back on track, working on racial injustice. But we need to start embracing the fact that we're the second largest city in the state, the 8th largest in the country. I think by acting accordingly, we'll be able to take care of many of the problems that we seem to talk a lot about but never get progress on.
Tell me about what you were doing here today.
So I was here volunteering some time at Cafe Madeline in North Park. They're participating in the state-funded Great Plates program. This is a pandemic response effort that attempts to solve two problems. One is a need for senior nutrition and address their isolation as our seniors, who are of course vulnerable to COVID-19, must shelter at home. And then the problem of restaurants that have been harmed by the economic recession, unable to open, unable to employ people. So Cafe Madeline gets some assistance from FEMA, from the state, and from the county, use those dollars to fund nutritious meals that can be given to seniors in the community. It's a win all the way around. Owner here was sharing that she's basically able to double their employment because of this program, which is helping them get through the pandemic, and it's certainly helping many, many seniors in our community get the food that they need.
You were on the city council for 8 years. You've been in public service for a long time. You've been in the assembly for 4 years almost. What are your proudest accomplishments there?
Well, I think there are some major highlights. I think given what is going on across California and the fact that our climate crisis is front and center and in all of our faces, I'm proud that many years ago I was able to lead the city to adopt a landmark climate action plan. We did it on a unanimous bipartisan vote of the city council, which I think is even still remarkable today. And it really put San Diego on the map when it comes to fighting the climate crisis and taking action. I think it's a part of an overall economic development strategy that's going to help grow green jobs in our community that actually will help more folks be able to afford to live here. But importantly, it's a signal that we're going to lead on this issue. And in many ways, I think this is instructive of my mayoral campaign. This is one of the rare times where we did lead, where we struck out before others had, and other folks have followed. And I just happen to think that San Diego would be better off if we lead more often. And I hope to do that as next mayor. In addition to that, I'm proud of the minimum wage and paid sick days ordinance that we went to hell and back to pass. Passed through the city council, override a mayoral veto, defeated a referendum at the ballot box. I think it's a reflection of the persistence that I bring to this role, a recognition that people are hurting and they need a champion, and that they can't, accept excuses or accept defeat. You have to keep pushing forward. That particular measure increased wages for 250,000 San Diegans, provided paid sick days to even more people. And I think those paid sick days have proven their value during the pandemic when many people had to choose about whether or not to go to work sick or be able to stay home and provide for their family. Beyond that, I've done pieces of legislation on housing in the legislature that I think are starting to bear fruit. Frankly, legislation that I hope to use as mayor to address our housing affordability crisis in San Diego. But in many ways, my work is not done. I really want to take the experiences I've had at City Hall, in Sacramento, as a congressional staffer, as a county employee, and put them to the benefit of San Diegans and help move the city forward.
What do you think are the biggest and most important differences between you and your opponent in this race?
I think there's a difference when it comes to our lives and our experiences, as well as our priorities. San Diegans are hurting. We're dealing with the worst economy in almost a century, and folks need to have people in positions of leadership that understand that struggle, that know what people are experiencing. I was just discussing with the chef inside, and the fact that most of his family have lost their jobs and he's the sole breadwinner, and understanding what you do, how to do that when you make a very low amount of money relative to what it takes to live in San Diego. I grew up in a working class family. I rode the bus as a young man. I understand what a lot of folks must do to get by. I also point out I'm a renter, so I recognize the fear of coming home and finding a notice on my door about a rent increase that I may or may not be able to afford. So it's that lived experience that I think is instructive and very different from my opponent in this campaign. Also, my public sector experience. Councilmember Bree likes to criticize and I think demean the work I've done throughout a lifetime in public service. I make no apologies for spending my career serving my hometown. I love my hometown, and I'm going to do everything I can to make it better, and that's what I've tried to do in my career. And while I respect and honor her private sector experience, I would point out that our president had only private sector experience before he got to the White House, and I don't think that's worked out so well for our country. So I want to put my experiences at all levels of government to work at City Hall. And then lastly, I mentioned priorities. And I think we've heard a lot from the other campaign about things like vacation rentals and scooters. I think in a lot of ways that's the expression of a small town thinking. Most other cities have successfully addressed those issues, and San Diego continues to talk about them and rarely gets progress on either of them. In this campaign, I've made it very clear I'm interested in solving our homelessness crisis. I want to invest in a multimodal transportation system that gives people real choices from getting from A to B, and importantly, aggressively tackling our housing affordability crisis. So experiences and priorities.
Whoever wins this race is going to be inheriting one of the worst economies in recent memory, and that's impacting the city's finances. Pretty recently, there was a report that came out that said the city's current budget for the current fiscal year overestimated how much hotel tax revenue we're going to be taking in. If you're successful in this election and you are tasked with coming up with a budget in the next fiscal year and you're called upon to find areas to cut in the budget, where and how would you do that?
Well, first off, this is an area where I think I have relevant experience. I served as the city's budget chair for 6 of the 8 years that I was at City Hall. We were able to take the city from massive budget deficits resulting from the Great Recession, turn them into surpluses and reserves that thankfully will help mitigate some of the cuts that will be necessary going forward. I would point out that the city was running a deficit prior to the pandemic, a really reflection of, I think, the poor fiscal stewardship over the last 4 years by this mayor and by my opponent, who is the chair of the budget committee. Of course, that problem has gotten worse. Again, I'd point out that some of those projections that you're talking about, I think, were relatively evident when this budget was adopted. And again, sort of owing to a lack of the persistence and diligence that is necessary to get the city out of the ditch that it's in. I've done this before, I can do it again. To answer your question directly, listen, public safety, of course, has to be our top priority. It is stated so in the charter, and making sure that folks can have a medical response when necessary, fire response when necessary, a police response when necessary is, of course, most important. In previous times, what we were able to do was figure out ways to work with our employees to try and get through this time, go to the bargaining table and come to an agreement. I imagine some of that will happen. Finding efficiencies and reductions that are necessary, particularly at the executive level and middle management of the city, seems obvious. I would point out a lot of that growth has been over the last 4 years, and it's, I think, again, a difference in this campaign. And Andrew, what we need to do is to make, I think, a longer-term thinking than what has been in evidence in recent years at City Hall. The cuts that we need to make or will have to make have to be done with an eye towards short-term pain, but for long-term gain. A recognition that we have to do everything we can to get our economy get the economy back on track, because that's how we'll generate the revenues to make this hopefully a 2-year situation and not a 4 or 8 year situation. You're going to see me advocating aggressively at the state and federal level to make sure that the CARES Act is not the last bit of federal relief that we see. That obviously could go a long way to helping us make ends meet in the short term. And then, doing the kinds of things that I think if we did, we would have perhaps more revenue. I mean, the fact that the city's been incapable of regulating short-term vacation rentals means that a significant amount of tourism taxes are not being collected. And I would point out that my opponent, this is her main issue and has not been able to get a resolution on it. The fact that we had scooters operating in our city for nearly 2 years without them paying much more than a business license fee, the independent budget analyst projected that we could yield over $2 million in revenue if we had just regulated them, and that's about $4 million right there that you could see that we could have to prevent cuts to neighborhood services. So I guess I point out that through strategic cuts, long-term thinking, and the ability to make sure that the revenues that we are owed we're actually collecting could go a long way to lessening the pain that we're going to experience, acknowledging that of course there'll be pain because the economy is just that bad.
When the City Council held its budget vote, it was inundated with calls from the public to defund the police. And I think behind that is this narrative or this explanation or narrative that over the years the police budgets have grown bloated. They've been, in some cases, given responsibilities that they're not necessarily trained or equipped for, and that all of the money that we're putting towards our police budget could be better spent on other things, and we should take money from the police budget and give it to other priorities like public transit, parks, libraries, etc. Do you share that? Do you believe in that narrative?
So I do not support defunding the police. I think it's an overly simplistic hashtag for a much more complex situation. Here's what I know. While this is a very controversial issue, there is areas of common ground. That whether it is the activists who are understandably marching in the streets to law enforcement, there's an agreement that we have asked more of our police officers than they're trained to do or they're comfortable doing. And so migrating responsibilities around mental health emergencies, homeless outreach, truancy sweeps, and giving those responsibilities to other trained professionals probably can be done at less cost to taxpayers. And the savings from that could be invested in a host of neighborhood services that I think would be potential for being preventative in terms of their approach rather than reactive approach that I think a lot of folks are concerned about. But on the flip side of that coin, I want to point out that some of the stuff that we're going to need to do to reform law enforcement to match the expectations of present-day San Diegans may cost a lot more money. I think specifically about Measure B, which will reform our police review board. It's a measure that I strongly support and have said that I'm committed to implementing fully and faithfully. That will come with a significant additional cost. I think that is money well spent in order to enjoy the trust of the communities that we are sworn to protect and serve. And so that's an area of additional cost. A lot of folks have pointed out that professions like hairstylists require more training than law enforcement officers do. I think that's an interesting observation, and perhaps we do need to increase the amount of training for our law enforcement officers. Again, that's an additional cost. And then I would observe that the fact that our police officers often can't afford to live in the cities that they serve is a reason why there's a greater gap between the community and law enforcement. And paying them a wage that actually allowed them to live in the communities they serve would be an effective way of bridging that gap and allowing us to better serve the community. So I see a host of areas where additional costs could exist. I see some areas for savings, and my commitment is to make sure that we look at the budget in a comprehensive fashion and try and address this to align law enforcement to match the expectations of the community. The last thing I would say is I do think the City Council made a wise move by creating the Office of Race and Equity. And I'm hopeful that that department can get stood up and provide some thoughtful recommendations to the City Council and to the Mayor's office for how we can better align city practices, acknowledging this is not just a law enforcement issue. Structural racism exists in our economic development strategies, in our housing strategies, in our education system. And so it has to be a bigger conversation than just law enforcement, because there's plenty of ways that Black and brown people are not given an equitable share of our community's of benefits, and we need to be focused on that bigger conversation.
The current mayor chose not to dip into the city's general fund reserves in this current budget. Was that the right choice, and is that something that you would consider next year if you're successful in?
Well, he was able to do that because the federal government sent the city about $250 million. And so preserving the reserves, recognizing this is going to be a multi-year challenge, was, I think, probably a reasonable step. Absent additional federal assistance, I suspect that is going to have to be on the table. During my time as the chair of the budget committee, we have multiple reserves. We created additional reserves to try and prepare for situations exactly like this, or situations like this, maybe not as extreme. And so, that has to be on the table, as well as a host of other budget corrections to get us through this time. I think what was the flaw in what was passed is the fact that they perhaps had overly rosy forecasts for revenue that really allowed them to approve a budget that I think most people recognize was not balanced, is abundantly clear today that that is the case, and it is likely that the next mayor will have to take decisive action, maybe the first day they're in office, to address this imbalance. I don't think this mayor did any favors to the next mayor in terms of having to deal with the city's finances.
How do you think Mayor Faulkner has done with handling the COVID-19 pandemic?
I think he's done a reasonable job. I mean, recognizing and controlling for the fact that, the county and the state have bigger roles in this response. But to the extent that, the city has tried to manage this and been responsive to try and provide relief to small businesses, I think those are highlights. I think areas of criticism or areas where I see improvement that's possible. I've been sort of befuddled by the fact that the county and the city hold separate daily press conferences to inform the public about what's going on. I think that that's not a strategic move in the sense that it allows for two different narratives. Maybe most of the time they're on the same page, but it allows for some level of daylight between the city and the county. And I think at a time when we're asking the public to follow our directions, we need to be in lockstep with the lead agency, which is the county. The city should be right there, and to the extent that these are separate press conferences with separate messaging, I think it lends to potential confusion for the public, and right now is not the time for confusion. Now is the time for building of trust. Another area where I was frustrated, I think like a lot of San Diegans, was in both the closure and reopening of our beaches. The city of San Diego took decisive action to close its beaches early in the pandemic, but did it without consulting other beach cities in the state of California, again leading to confusion about which beaches are open and which are closed, funneling more people to certain beaches at a time when we're asking folks to have social distance. And then the exact opposite happened when arbitrarily the beaches were decided to be reopened, again not coordinating with those other cities. That lack of coordination again communicates to the public a sense of disorganization. That is the wrong thing to project right now. What we have to project is confidence, trust, and good information. And so I think I see areas for improvement, but to the extent that we're one of the few Southern California counties that are in Tier 2 rather than Tier 1, I think that there is some kudos that are deserved for local officials who've been working hard on this response.
Councilmember Breeze criticized you for your vote in favor of SB 1120 to allow duplexes on lots currently restricted to single-family homes. And of course, it didn't become law because it missed the deadline to get a final vote in the Senate. But explain why you decided to support that bill.
Well, I think that piece of legislation was a modest step towards meeting our housing production goals that, because we're not currently meeting them, so many San Diegans, so many Californians don't see a future for themselves in San Diego. I disagree strongly with the characterization of my opponent of what this bill is. I just disagree strongly with her rhetoric on housing. Councilmember Bree is traded in a lot of the same rhetoric that we see from President Trump when it comes to housing, and really using fear and division to try and guide this conversation at a time when we need more housing that regular people can afford. So it's not only her characterization of this bill, but it's her rhetoric in general that I just disagree with. Listen, I get it. San Diegans can't afford the rent. Too many of them can't seem to be able to buy a home. And this piece of legislation was an effort that would allow individual property owners to make a modest modification to their property to create housing that is naturally affordable without a public subsidy. On balance, I think that seemed like the right thing to do. The last thing I would say is that we do have a disagreement about whether or not any state action is necessary. I would point out the inconsistency. My opponent fully embraces accessory dwelling units, rather hypocritically not acknowledging that that was motivated by state legislation. But I'll set that aside. I think what she's missing is the fact that San Diego can't solve the state's housing crisis all by itself. We shouldn't be asked to shoulder the responsibilities of the entire state right here in our city. And we have cities across California that simply are not interested in providing any additional housing. San Diego's trying, it's making efforts, and while we may not be getting where we need to be, at least there's some acknowledgement of this problem and some attempts at reform. I think of cities across this country, across the state, I think probably most notably Cupertino, California, that wants all the benefits of hosting Apple's world headquarters, but none of the responsibility of housing the employees that work there. And so when cities like that thumb their nose at this humanitarian crisis that is our housing affordability crisis, I think the state should come in and ask folks to do more. And so it's a fundamental disagreement. It's something that Councilmember Bree didn't previously disagree with. In 2016, she was clearly on the record as supporting this kind of legislation. Her change of mind, only she would have to explain. But I've been consistent on this issue. I think the rent's too high. I think too many people can't afford to buy a home in San Diego, and I don't think we can be a great city if we're just a place for the very wealthy who can afford to live here and the very poor who are trapped here. We have to have housing that working and middle-class San Diegans can afford.
She and other critics of that legislation said that it would accelerate gentrification, allow investors to buy up cheaper homes in low-income neighborhoods, tear them down and build duplexes, pushing out, residents that might have lived there for a long time. Tell me why you disagree with that.
Well, because it would be in the decision of the existing property owner. If you own a home in North Park and you want to subdivide it to do a duplex, that would be your decision. It's different from what many others are championing, including my opponent, which is generally larger scale development, not in their neighborhood, near transit. And there's a place for that kind of housing. But ultimately, this would be decided by the individual property owner. It allows them to make the call. And a lot of the testimony we heard around this bill was about folks who are concerned about where their kids are going to live, where their grandkids are going to live. I understand the concerns about gentrification. I think that's generally a concern that is understandable, unrelated to this piece of legislation. But when you consider who would be the decision maker in whether or not they would use the authorities under this legislation, it would be the existing property owner. And I actually trust individual San Diegans to do what's right for them and for their families and for their community, rather than the big developers that my opponent seems to be much more comfortable calling the shots.
So I believe you support Measure A, the affordable housing bond, on the November ballot. Well, I just hadn't had the chance to make sure of it, but I assumed, and I believe that's the case. So, your opponent hasn't made up her mind. She told me about it. There was even some skepticism from some progressive members of the city council on whether some San Diegans, homeowners, and perhaps even renters, these things often are passed down to renters, could afford a property tax increase at a time like this when the economy is so fragile. Tell me why you support Measure A and why you're not as concerned about those concerns.
I support Measure A because we have a housing and homelessness crisis that is unacceptable, and we have to do something about it. This is a local measure. We get to decide what to do with those funds. The ability to solve this problem as a local community, to create the housing that we desperately need, it's just self-evident that we have to do something about this. As a state legislator, I believe that creating this local funding source may give us the opportunity to leverage that for state and federal funding that may actually allow us to build more than the roughly 8,000 homes that are being envisioned in this measure. But ultimately, even in this pandemic, even in this recession, even with people marching in the streets, the most common thing that is shared with me as a concern by San Diegans is homelessness. They see thousands of our neighbors sleeping outdoors, unsheltered, and they want something done about it. And this is a way we can do something about it. While others will navel gaze and stare at their toes and say, not now, not now, I know that in San Diego, too often, later becomes never. And right now we have a crisis on our hands, and my conscience, my heart, says that we have to do something, and this is something that I believe will have a significant positive impact on this significant crisis that we're facing.
The next mayor will have a big say in the next regional transportation plan developed by SANDAG. And you've supported it. Your opponent has criticized it. Other critics of the plan say it's too expensive. It relies on voters approving a sales tax increase. Perhaps relies on unproven technologies that, with the stakes so high in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and combating climate change, we can't afford to rely on those types of ideas that haven't yet proven themselves to work. Tell me why you support that vision from the executive director of SANDAG and what you like about the plan.
Well, I certainly support the vision. There are details within it that need to be hashed out, but ultimately it's a decision to say that we are going to have a world-class transportation system in San Diego. My opponent has aligned with the Republicans on the board of directors at SANDAG, really embracing a 20th century approach. Instead, I believe we should be building a transportation system for the 21st century. And I think it's really important because you mentioned price tag, and that's not insignificant. I'm cheap, and so I want to know where taxpayer dollars are going and making sure that this is the right investment. I would point out that the status quo approach endorsed by Councilmember Bree and others, we still spend over $130 billion to basically end up where we are today. What I and others are advocating for is a vision that is roughly $170 billion, but instead we actually get the active transportation, the mass transit network, the highway network that actually gives consumers choices. I don't know about you, but I'm frustrated that the only way to get around this town in any kind of convenient fashion is by car. And we're a great American city. I believe we're a world-class city, but our transportation system doesn't reflect that. We need to start building that, and I would point out that if we start today, it's still going to take decades to build the system that we need. And so people like to say, not now, this is not the right time, later. Later is always going to become never in San Diego. And so I'm saying we need to act decisively to say we will embrace this vision, we will work on the details, but we got to get to work. And the reason for this is not just what I personally may support. This is evident by what we need to do under our obligations in our climate action plan. It is necessary for our continued economic growth in San Diego, and it's necessary to protect our quality of life. You know, if others don't want to support protecting our quality of life, our economy, and our environment, that's their decision. But I will always stand up for all three of those things.
I want to talk about 101 Ash Street.
Sure.
We can get to the fabricated footnote in a minute, but first let's talk about your vote in favor of that deal. So this is an issue that your opponent has made a big deal in the campaign about. We can watch the video. You were enthusiastically supporting this deal that has ultimately become a real money pit for San Diego taxpayers. Do you regret that vote?
My vote was informed by the information that we were given at the time. To the extent that what we were told was going to happen and what has happened are two different things, yeah, I absolutely regret that. And I'm angry about what happened. But I think you have to look at it as totality. In terms of my support, as chair of the budget committee, I knew that we were spending millions to lease space all throughout San Diego. Our city hall is inadequate, does not accommodate all of our city employees, and we were making a lot of folks a whole lot of money by renting out of their buildings. And this was an opportunity to save money, roughly $40 million, to bring all of our employees essentially under one roof and benefit from the collaboration and synergy that would come from doing that. We were told the building was in pristine condition, that it was in move-in condition, such that we actually bought all the furniture in the building. That's how quickly we intended to move in and occupy that building. And so when faced with the opportunity to create a more pleasant working environment for our employees at the city, to save $40 million and to do it in a relatively quick fashion, to go from being renters to being owners, that made a lot of sense to me. What we've subsequently come to find out is that maybe the building wasn't in as good a condition as was represented. But what has never been made clear to me was in 2016, we were supposed to move into that building straight away. In 2018, we still hadn't occupied the building. A building that was told to be in pristine condition in 2018 suddenly needed a $30 million remodel. And let's be clear, that remodel is what exposed asbestos and made the building uninhabitable. My opponent supported that vote. I like to say, I bought a building, she broke it. And so we all share responsibility for our vote. I believe I've been clear in accepting that responsibility. I know that she has not. And this is the other context I think is important. I get why 101 Ash is a focal point, but we have to talk about the indoor skydiving facility on Imperial Avenue that was purchased from a politically connected donor to the mayor and to my opponent with no appraisal for a homeless shelter that houses nobody. Or the Othello Avenue property in Kearny Mesa that was purchased to be a service yard for city vehicles, but actually isn't big enough to accommodate those vehicles. I voted for one of those projects. She voted for all three of those projects. So there is a need for reform at real estate assets. I'm focused on what we can do to fix 101 Ash and reform that department rather than the blame game that my opponent has chosen to engage in, I think, to the detriment of our city and moving forward.
So about that forged document that was given to NBC7 and the story that they ultimately retracted, implying that you had known more about this deal at the time. Now that the story has been retracted and we're continuing to talk about 101 Ash Street and continuing to wonder what the city will actually do about it. What do you want San Diegans to know about that episode?
That it was a crime and someone needs to be held accountable. Here we are 2 weeks later. We still don't know who leaked that document. We don't know who forged that document, but we do know who benefited from doing all of that, and that's my opponent. Within minutes of that story being published, she had Facebook ads up almost instantly, pushing this narrative out there. And I think it goes to a level of politics that we shouldn't accept here in San Diego, and continues to be a distraction from actually solving the problem that we find ourselves in. Ultimately, we need to know who did this. They need to be held accountable, and we need to know that before the election. We had a national election in 2016 where the public wasn't told everything that was going on until afterward. And I think many of us are frustrated by the outcome of that election and the misinformation that was provided to the public. Right now, San Diegans have the same problem on their hands, and I'm hopeful that between NBC, who still has a lot of work to do to make this right, as well as law enforcement, we'll get to the bottom of this quickly. San Diegans need to have all the information when they go to the polls. Right now, they don't have all the information. What they have is a significant amount of misinformation that my opponent has used to benefit herself and her campaign.
Is there anything else you'd like to add?
You don't want to ask about 145?
I mean, we're almost at time here.
Yeah,
so,
I know. Nick needs me to go. I don't think there's much to be. I'm frustrated by the amount of state legislation that people want to talk about in this race that are unrelated to the job of mayor. And it's usually done with a lens that really repeats rhetoric that comes from the president. And that should be alarming to all San Diegans. I recognize and respect the office that Donald Trump occupies. But I think San Diegans know full well that this has not been a good 4 years. We need to make a change. And so anyone who wants to parrot that kind of rhetoric, that kind of division, is not something that we can support here in San Diego, and not someone that you should vote for. And the last thing I would probably say is just, you asked before about differences, and there is a difference in terms of our visions for the city. I think my opponent has a very small vision for San Diego. It's one where, we can't have a world-class transportation system, where we can't make space for working and middle-class people in our neighborhoods, where we don't have a plan to deal with the most vulnerable in our community, the homeless. I have a bigger vision, a vision that says that if you were willing to work hard and play by the rules, we'll make room for you here, that you can succeed here, that you should have opportunity here. And San Diegans shouldn't accept somebody with a vision so small that it excludes them and their families. They should vote for someone who's going to get up every single day and fight on their behalf, and that's me.
All right, thanks so much for your time.